I want to thank Dr. Andrew Campbell for inviting me this evening to talk about anti-Black racism in the city of Toronto. For the last year and a half, the municipal government has decided to take on the issue of anti-Black racism in Toronto and look at how it's affecting the Black community. Although Toronto is considered one of the most diverse cities in the world, studies continue to show that anti-Black racism still exists in the city, and it affects the life chances of more than 200,000 Black people who call Toronto home. So today, we're going to talk a little bit about anti-Black racism. We're going to look at some key terms that I think you should be aware of, especially when you're looking at anything to do with anti-oppression, anti-Black racism. We're going to look at the impact of anti-Black racism, a quick review of what it is, exploration of how it's perpetuated in the city, what are some actions that should happen, and some key messages to wrap up the presentation. So some of the terminologies I think that we should be familiar with are privilege, oppression, colonialism, and intersectionality. And so I have a slide on each of these terms, and I'm going to talk very quickly about them. So privilege, often a lot of us say that we don't have privilege and that we're successful because of the hard work that we do. But the concept of privilege is tricky because people view it as a personal attack when in reality it describes power relations in society. The truth of the matter is that privilege is related to historical events that lay the foundation in what we see in society today. One example is that colonialism has privileged certain races over others, and primarily the white race over others. And so when we look at privilege, when we see what has currency, if you're white, if you're male, if you're middle to upper class, if you're Christian, if you're cisgender, if you're able-bodied, and you're heterosexual, you're considered privileged. And you need to be aware of this privilege, and it shouldn't be seen as guilt, but more it should be seen as what's your responsibility to ensure that you help to create an inclusive world. The other one we want to look at is oppression. And oppression is linked to concepts such as privilege, intersectionality and identity, as well as historical events such as colonialism and imperialism. It is the opposite of privilege. Oppression occurs when established laws, customs, and practices systematically reflect and produce inequities based on one's member in a targeted social identity group. Colonialism is very tricky in Canada because we often like to think that our history of treating people fairly is different from that of the United States. We want to believe, or we've learned, that we have treated the indigenous peoples, Blacks, and other people of racialized background a lot fairer than the U.S. did because of slavery. But it's fair to say that that's a common myth, that we teach that the slavery did not exist in Canada, when in fact slavery and segregation existed in Canada for over 200 years. And why wouldn't it? I mean, Canada was under British colonial power, so why would slavery not have existed here? Slavery was legal in New France and in Lower Canada under British rules. People in all levels of society owned slaves. And a fact that you need to know is that the founder of McGill University, James McGill, owned slaves. When slavery ended, did you know that Blacks who entered Canada were not met with open arms? Instead, they faced segregation in schools, employment, and housing. And a really good example of that is in Nova Scotia, where you have generations of Blacks who have gone through and faced oppression and racism in that province, as well as in Ontario, in Chatham and Windsor, and those areas where there's been a long-standing Black community of many, many generations. Intersectionality is a phrase that's it's being used quite often now. It was introduced by a legal scholar called Kimberly Crenshaw. And it's really a framework for understanding the ways that multiple aspects of our identities intersect, influence one another, and compound to create unique experiences. The concept is regularly used to describe the ways that societal privilege and oppression is complicated by the different parts of our identity that are marginalized or privileged in this society. So for myself, I'm a Black female, highly educated, grew up mainly middle class, consider myself, I'm heterosexual, I'm able-bodied. But different parts of my identity causes oppression for me. So gender would be a key one, and race would be the two pieces of my identity that would cause a lot of oppression, and it's areas in which I wouldn't be very privileged today. So today we want to talk about anti-Black racism, and we want to look at what the city has decided to do. So to confront anti-Black racism in the city of Toronto, a year and a half ago, the city government launched a three-phase process. Phase one was the development and launch of the Toronto for All Public Education campaign, naming and challenging anti-Black racism. Phase two was a review of 41 years worth of research and recommendations about addressing anti-Black racism in Toronto. You know, for years, Black citizens in the city have been challenging the government to look at what we've been going through, and many reports have been written and many reports have been shelved. Phase three was to determine how best to take meaningful action going forward. And so, you know, the city and the Black community came together and did conversations across the city. And in May of 2017, they were able to provide feedback to the city. Anti-Black racism is not a new term. Stephen Lewis' report first coined the phrase anti-Black racism after the Young Streets riots, which took place because of the beating of Rodney King in California. Other racial groups impacted by systemic discrimination in Ontario. However, the Black community is more vulnerable and acutely disadvantaged when it comes to anti-Black racism. It's an integral part of institution policies and practices, and it's often invisible until impact is assessed. It appears normal or invisible to the larger white society. As I said, people are very familiar with the term racism, and racism is a system that is implemented in every part of the legal, social, economic structure of this country and continues to this day due to these systems being upheld. Anti-Black racism is prejudice, attitudes, beliefs, stereotyping, and/or discrimination that is directed at people of African descent and is rooted in their unique history and experience of enslavement and colonization. As I said earlier, there's been 40 years of action in this city, and last year, you know, we seriously started to look at 40 years of report and begin to identify themes that have come up through those reports that we can now finally address under anti-Black racism. Historically, we've always been advocates for our cause, but it's always fell on deaf ears. And I think for once, under the leadership of John Tory, the city has decided to finally listen to us and take some action around this matter. There are different types of racism. And the next two slides, we're going to look at how racism is played out in the lives of Black people. The first one is racial microaggressions, and the next one is structural racism or systemic racism. Before I go on to start talking about racial microaggressions, I think we need to understand that racism is not a personal thing. People act in ways that perpetuate racism, but we need to understand that racism operates within a larger system. Remember, racism is power plus prejudice, and it's not just racially based opinions. So let's talk a little bit about racial microaggressions. It's often never meant to hurt. It's acts that are done with little consciousness, and people are very aware of their meanings and effect. Instead, they slowly accumulate over a lifetime, and in part, it's what defines a marginalized experience, making explanation and communication with someone who does not share this identity particularly difficult. And so, you know, ways in which this plays out is people would say to you, oh, you speak English very well. Oh, your name is too hard, so I won't pronounce it. And so we often try to change our names to make it comfortable for somebody who can't pronounce it to be able to pronounce it. Or some that we're familiar with in the Black community. Oh, you don't act like a normal Black person. I don't know what a normal Black person acts like. And another thing that some of us who are well educated may get is, why do you sound so white? You know, so those are some of the racial microaggressions that people will say to us and not realizing, not conscious that they're saying these things. And then there's the larger system of racism. You know, you find it across institutions, and it combines with a system that negatively impacts people of color. You know, it operates in our policies, our laws, and in organizations. And it contributes to the oppression of certain racialized groups. And in this case, we're talking primarily about this, the Black community. And we see it in our school system, in the justice system, and within the government. Later on, I'll talk a little bit about the justice system and the school system, how it plays out. And so we called on the city government to start taking some action because we want Toronto to be an inclusive and prosperous city for us to live in. We feel and we know that we contribute to all areas of city life. But studies show that although we're here and we're contributing to the city's life, it shows that we're disenfranchised from the wider society. And we see this as the overrepresentation in the criminal justice system. You may be familiar with the report that came out 2 years ago about our overrepresentation in the child welfare system, 47%, although we make up 8% of the population. We are among the most poor, we're unemployed, and we're precariously employed. So the systems that reflect and affect, as I said earlier, children and youth development, community engagement and Black leadership, health and community supports, job opportunities and income supports, policing, and the justice system. I talk a lot about children and youth because it's something that I'm passionate about, and it's a piece of work that I've been doing for over 20 years with children and Black youth. And we see that 42% of our children are in care, although we make up 8% of the Black population. And this happens because people have not taken time to understand our culture and the ways in which we raise our children or the ways in which our family function. A child may come to school and say something, and the teacher will undoubtedly take it out of context, and right away children's aid and the police is alerted, and this results in our children being removed from our home and living with people who do not look like them. And so we see a loss of culture and a loss of community. Black youth have higher dropout rates, and we see this because of policies that are drawn up by our educational system. You know, you see policies of no tolerance, and a lot of those policies are geared towards children, to Black children, where they're pushed out of the school system. We see our children are streamed into lower educational expectation. The employment rate of Black youth is 2 times higher than the national average. If you look at the report done by United Way several years ago on discrimination by postal code, most of the Black community reside within social housing, and this affects them getting a good paying job. And Black youth report not feeling welcome or supported in programs that are funded for them. And a lot of Black youth will tell you that when they go into community centers and programs are set up for them, they're not well staffed, and sometimes those programs get canceled often, and they're not able to use the services of their local community center. When we look at the police and the justice system, Blacks make up 3% of the population. However, we account for 10% of inmates. And this is due to, that we're disproportionately targeted by the police. We are carded more often than any other racialized group in the city. And when the police do harass young Black folks, there is no oversight policing to keep them in check that this should not be happening. Young Black people are so distrustful of the system that we don't even have them reporting that they're being over-policed often. We see that the neighborhoods that we lived in are over-policed and consistently under siege by police. And so this would account for the large number of inmates that you see in our prison system, although we are a small, we make up a small number of the population. And so we say action now. And so in the last year and a half, many of us within the community, within the social service sector, private citizens and businesses have been working to see changes take place. We want to see improvement in the education system to support safe and effective learning for Black children and youth. We want to see improvement in the child welfare system to better serve and support Black children and youth. We want to see improved job quality and income support for precariously employed Black people. And finally, we want to see measures implemented to stop racial profiling and over-policing of Black people, especially over-policing of our young Black men. And so, we have a key role to play in seeing some of these changes occur. Black Lives Matter has grown out of a movement in the U.S., and it's here, and we're in full support of the way in which they challenge our city government to make changes. If they say diversity is our strength, we need to live up to this, and we need to do what is socially right to ensure that the Black community feels that they are needed and wanted in the city. First of all, we need to admit that anti-Black racism is the root cause of the issue faced by Blacks and the Black community. The mayor was finally able to admit to that in May of 2017 when the feedback from the conversations were given to him. I want to leave you with some key messages. Journalist Desmond Cole said last year, "There is no domain in Canadian life that racism and anti-Black racism does not exist. Racism affects us all differently, and it is important that this is acknowledged. We need to pay sufficient attention to the intricacies of the many complex intersections of race, racism, racial discrimination, and more importantly, we need to use the privileges that we have to challenge social justice if we envision a city that is good for us all."